afternoon, Yona.
Yeah.
Proceed with the witness.
Yes, please, as you're ready.
Thank you. So Dr. Coates, before the break, we were dealing with slides 16 and 17. So we were looking at the primary motivations. So we shall now proceed to slide 18 and go in a little bit further detail into these motivations. And at slide 18, you speak about the encouragement of confederation by the United Kingdom, right?
Correct.
Can you go through these bullets for us and expand a little bit?
Yes, I will. The one of the central points of Confederation is that it was not done in opposition to Britain. It was not a protest or rejection of Britain. There was not strong animosity, anger between them. Quite the opposite. Britain was very much of the mind that it was time for the colonies to stand on their own. The British Empire had reached all around the world. This was the era of the sun never sets on the British Empire. But the British Empire was changing in ways that I'll quickly describe. The first bullet here talks about the fact that the colonies, not just UPC, had become a drain on the resources of the United Kingdom. They were spending money on the colonies, and they weren't so keen to do so anymore. Second point was that the colonies were feeling that. They were looking to Britain for everything from loan guarantees and support and investments and things of that sort that would actually allow them to expand, build their infrastructure, grow and develop. And Britain was, say, lukewarm to those ideas. They didn't abandon UPC. They didn't abandon the British North American colonies. They just moved slowly and reluctantly on these sort of different ambitions and things of that sort. And particularly when UPC and some of the other colonies started talking about a larger union, a union that might stretch all the way across the continent. For some British politicians who were involved with their own affairs, they had a lot of big issues going on in England, particularly around industrialization and workers' rights and things of that sort, a lot of reform sort of political movements at that time. They could see that the ambition of Canada was growing, some of these colonies was growing larger and larger. So there was then in Britain this willingness to consider a different arrangement and a different relationship with them and to see them go toward more independence. The third one bullet is important, and that is that there was a concern that if things worked out poorly, that the colonies would become a source of tension with the United States. And those tensions could actually lead to sort of additional conflicts and some additional sort of challenges. And one thing, just as an example of this, in the 1840s, the Americans were expressing an interest in what's called the Oregon Territory. So the Oregon Territory, we know it now as Washington State and Oregon, so the mouth of the Columbia River sort of area, and what also Puget Sound. And the Americans said, we want this. And British North Americans, including Hudson's Bay Company, which was active in that area, said, we don't want you to have it. So Britain got involved in a negotiation and a treaty that was signed in the 1840s, allocated a big chunk of the Oregon Territory to the United States. So if you just imagine, the 49th parallel just south of Vancouver, British Columbia is the boundary. But if you go back into the 1840, the boundary was the Columbia River at best and probably further south than that. Okay, so Britain is sort of not going to cause a fight. British North America was not happy with this, but Britain was content to sort of trade off peace and tranquility with the United States. And a lot of this relates down to my last bullet, is that that Britain was still responsible for the military protection of British North America. And that actually caused them considerable expense. You have to have fortifications, you have to have soldiers, you have ships, a navy presence in the area. And remember, again, this is the context that I think helps explain the urgency of the 1860s. Why are all these things coming together in the 1860s? And one of the reasons is the American Civil War. And the American Civil War starts in 1860, ends in 1865. It was one of the most vicious and mean-spirited military conflicts in world history. Hundreds of thousands of Americans killed hundreds of thousands of other Americans. It was a terrible, terrible conflict. Britain was perceived as being sympathetic to the South. So the northern tier American states were very upset with what was going on and were upset with Britain. You can see Britain sort of finding itself embroiled in North American affairs and very much wanting to stay away. So the mechanisms for encouraging Confederation, very simple. When British North American politicians talked about some sort of larger union, some sort of confederation, they were encouraged to do so. They received a sympathetic hearing. Certain individuals, Georges Etienne Cartier, the French-Canadian leader, was a huge fan of England and spent a fair bit of time talking to political leaders and being engaged with them. And he was encouraged to sort of, follow your dreams, kind of an idea. More practically, the governor generals of the colonies were instructed as much as possible within the limits of their power to encourage confederation. That they were to also talk to the premiers of the individual colonies, the legislatures, the politicians there, and the community leaders, and to sort of promote, not push, but at least promote the idea of a larger union.
Thank you. So moving on to the next slide, slide 19. So at slide 19, you speak about the ties between the colonies and Great Britain before Confederation were changing. Is slide 19 in a way connected to the points you make at slide 18, the previous slide?
Very much so.
And how is that?
So the role that the colonies played in the British economy and in British sort of ambitions generally had changed quite dramatically. If you go back to the early days of colonization, the British, among other nations, developed this concept of mercantilism, essentially the relationship between colonial areas and the mother country. And the idea was relatively straightforward, that the colonies would produce raw materials. In the Canadian context, they would produce timber in huge quantities, timber, very important, and wheat, fish, other products like that. Those raw materials would be sent back to England. England would use its access to these colonial resources to build its industrial economy and to actually build its own prosperity. So this sort of relationship of the colonies produce the raw materials, they come to the mother country, which produces the manufactured goods, which they then sell back to the colonies, was a very, very strong sort of element in the answer to the question, why does Britain have colonies? Why do they have an empire? Well, the answer for a long time was this process, which I think was very important. So if you go to the next bullet, if I could.
You mean the second bullet?
The second bullet, yes. Britain started to change the relationship. So the timber tariffs are a good example. Britain needed a large amount of wood. And just to use one example, New Brunswick is a very important source of masts, the mast for sailing ships. These had to be extremely strong trees. They had to be very straight, very tall. New Brunswick was very good at producing these masts, but so was the Baltic states. So the Baltic states were closer at hand. You could actually get the timber faster and cheaper from there. So the timber tariffs protected the colonial timber trade, which extended into the Ottawa River Valley, extended into central the north side of the St. Lawrence as well. So they canceled the timber tariffs. They canceled the Navigation Acts, which had been in place for a very, very long time. And the Navigation Act said that you had to have a British ship to bring raw materials to Britain. Gave a huge advantage, obviously, in that particular area, and that the raw materials were supposed to be shipped directly to Britain and nowhere else. So they canceled those acts in the later part of the 1840s, 1849 specifically. the British repealed them. So they're changing the very foundation of their economic relationship with the colonies. And on the one hand, you could imagine the colonies might well have a very strong sense of being abandoned. That all of a sudden Britain is pulled away and their colonial economy is sort of changing and very much threatened. But that doesn't happen. And there's two forces. One is in Britain. Britain is industrializing very quickly, so its economy is changing in different sorts of ways, not just in terms of trade, but this is when Britain became a world leader in industrial production. Factories all over the place in that particular country. Britain also became a leader in sort of global trade, expanding beyond the colonies and trading with other countries and other parts of the world in very substantial amounts. So what happens to the British North America? Two things. I'll put them in the reverse order. The declining trade, the last bullet on slide 19. British North America was developing stronger commercial ties with the United States. So it's losing access to Britain and that strong relationship, but at the same time, it's gaining stronger ties with the United States. And a huge part of this was some exemptions that were made to allow greater trade on the Great Lakes. There's an enormous amount of raw materials being sent from what is now Southern Ontario, Upper Canada, into the American markets. And in 1854, they negotiated a reciprocity treaty, a treaty essentially free trade with between these areas and the United States. So that's one. The other one, and this is sort of put in the back of your mind for later, in fact, even for post-Confederation period, when I say later, and that is that the maritime colonies were starting to face some major changes as well. And particularly the case in Nova Scotia. You can understand in New Brunswick because of the changes in the timber arrangements and the slow trade there, but the timber markets developed in the United States when they were sort of short in Britain. But people forget that Nova Scotia had one of the largest sailing fleets in the world. They always compared themselves and said they were third behind Britain, the United States, and Nova Scotia. So we're not talking here about 5 ships. We're talking about a huge set of ships. And these were the sort of the clipper ships that you saw, the blue nose kind of clippers. These were very.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you just to try to slow down.
Okay, well, sorry.
Yeah, you're going quite fast.
Okay. The clipper ships were very fast. They were very reliable ships, and they were very famous around the world for what they could produce, what they could deliver. And they were almost omnipresent. You would see them in the United States, you would see them in Britain and Europe, you would see them in the Caribbean. So they would have all of these ships going around the world. That starts to change around the 1870s and 1880s. And you could see a bit of it coming when they started developing metal ships, steel ships, because the steel ships were larger, they could travel faster, they could carry more cargo. So you went from having this wonderful, powerful, maritime trade that is really starting to decline quite dramatically. And just one point, because it reinforces another part of the challenge of the British North America colonies. The shipping industry oriented Nova Scotia toward the rest of the world, not toward British North America. So their trade was with other countries and with other regions. Their trade was with the Caribbean and with Africa and places like that. And one famous quote, when somebody was talking about why should you unite with Upper Canada, and the answer that was given was, or the comment that he made was, Nova Scotia has more ships in Calcutta, in India, than it has in Upper Canada, right? Because that's where the trade was, and that's their presence. So they weren't really oriented toward Upper Canada in the St. Lawrence. They were oriented to the rest of the world.
Thank you, Dr. Coates. I think we can move on to slide 20. So on slide 20, you speak about British North American concerns about the USA. So I know you are very passionate about that, but I would urge you to keep the pace a bit slow.
I do apologize.
So can you go through these bullets for us?
Yeah. After the American Revolution, the United States emerges as a nation in its own right with very big ambitions. They believed their political system was the future for a democratic world, for a capitalist world. And they developed internally this idea of manifest destiny. And manifest destiny essentially said that it was God's ambition that the United States would rule all of North America. And in fact, you see over time, their ambition was even greater than that, that they would, their values and their example would spread around the world. I mentioned already the two examples of this, the Revolutionary War, when they tried to incorporate British North America. A second example would be during the War of 1812, when American aggression led them into a battle with a war with Britain. The dynamic and the threat of manifest destiny changed quite dramatically during the American Civil War, because you now have a massively armed nation, realizing they're using the arms on each other, but this is a heavily militarized country. And this goes on to the second bullet, within the United States, there were more than a few people who said, we can repair our damage by expanding, by growing even further. And you can actually, this started before, remember the Oregon territory I described before, but they started to push even more aggressively. Let me use a couple of examples. James Polk, who was elected president of the United States in 1844, was campaigned on a policy of 54-40 or fight. And 54-40 is about 2/3 of the way up British Columbia. And that should be American territory. And if Britain won't give it to us, we'll take it. They compromised at the 49th parallel, but James Polk wanted the 54th parallel, 54-40, as their line. In 1850s, there was a major gold rush in British Columbia, largely Americans who came up into that gold rush. They came up from San Francisco and the California gold rush into Oregon territory and up into British Columbia as well. In Red River, which at this time was a very small agricultural / fur trading community in what's now southern Manitoba, started having American annexationists arrive. American proponents of the takeover of Red River and the Hudson's Bay Company territories moved into the community and started to agitate for integration. And the same thing happened in British Columbia. It wasn't just that there were lots of Americans there. The Americans said, we should stay. This should be our country and where we should stay. So the last point here, I think is an important one. The British North American colonies were very realistic. They did not think that they were going to stand up one for one against the Americans. American armies were huge, and they were very heavily mechanized in the context of that time. They were very, very well armed. But the idea was that individually, they had no chance. They weren't a deterrent. So if Americans decided they wanted New Brunswick, they would take New Brunswick. If they wanted to take Upper Canada, they could quite easily militarily take Upper Canada. That part is fairly obvious. The idea was that if they got together and you had all the British North America colonies united, they would at least be a more substantial barrier or bastion against any kind of American aggression. So the idea was, if we unite those British North American colonies that want to stay within the British system, they want to stay within the British Empire, then we'll have a much greater chance of surviving into the future.
I think we can move to the next slide, which is slide 21. So at slide 21, you speak of the increasing tensions in the UPC. I know you already dealt with a little bit with the UPC at slide 13. So can you go through these bullets here for us?
Yes, I'll do so promptly. Tensions just increased, and the situation wasn't getting better after the United Province of Canada was created in 1841. The French-English issue, as I described, was not instantly resolved. Those tensions got more developed over time. We also forget from the benefit of the 21st century that religion was an enormous source of contention in the United Province of the Canadas. So the division between Catholics and Protestants was huge. Very strong tensions and very strong animosity between those groups. If you add in, and I'm going here to the second bullet, the division between the conservatives and reformers. The reformers wanted to move to responsible government, past responsible government to real autonomy, to a more democratic sort of order. Conservatives, we have in Upper Canada and Lower Canada groups in Lower Canada, Canada East called the Chateau Clique, sort of the socioeconomic elite of Montreal, the Family Compact, the socioeconomic elite of the Toronto region and southern Ontario, that the Conservatives had a strong traditional base. And they were quite appalled by some of the expectations of the reformers. Reformers wanted to go too far. So what happens, and here I'm going on to the third bullet, is people are saying UPC doesn't work. It isn't solving our sectional difficulties. We haven't resolved the English-French difficulty. We haven't resolved the Catholic-Protestant difficulty. It's not resolving our financial challenges, all of which were serious and all of which were sustained in this period of time. So they started to think of other alternatives. So if not this,
So who's they?
sorry, the they in this context are the political leaders of UPC. My apologies. So they very much, they're looking and saying, how do we solve our problem? Given that there's not a desire to have the British solve it for them, they want to solve it themselves. So two different ideas emerged, one that didn't get a lot of traction. The first one was that you could take UPC and turn it into a federal unit, that you would actually have Canada East, Quebec as one unit, Ontario, Canada West as a second one, and erect some sort of a federal oversight that would actually mediate between the two, but allow them to be separate, but together. It was an idea that some people favored. The much greater ambition, and the one that attracted more attention, was the larger set of British North America colonies. That in fact, the issue here is people were in British North America, I'm not sure if jealous is the right word, but in admiring the success of the American experiment, except for slavery and the American Civil War. America had been widely successful on an economic front, attracted millions of settlers. They were expanding to the West. America had taken over Texas. They were taking over California. They were expanding transcontinental nation. So a lot of people and politicians in British North America were thinking that's a better way for us to sort of think of our future, for reasons I can discuss a little bit later on. So the last bullet here is that people started talking about a union of all British North America colonies, particularly Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, lesser extent Prince Edward Island, we'll talk about later, UPC. The attractive piece, the sort of the diamond here, was the Hudson's Bay Company holdings. The Hudson's Bay Company holdings were massive. They went from the Hudson Bay to the Rocky Mountains. They went down the Mackenzie Valley. This was a massive amount of territory. We later, it was called Rupert's Land, sort of at the time. And the view was that that area, those Hudson's Bay Company territories, could become like the American West. And it would be the place where you would attract not just hundreds of thousands of migrants, but millions of migrants. And those migrants would settle the prairies. They would produce economies, cities, settlement, all those kinds of things. But they would also be consumers for the products from central Canada. They would be the people who would buy the fish from the Maritimes, the produce from Southern Ontario. That would be how this would actually work out. So Newfoundland was a bit of an outlier. You notice it's not on the list. Newfoundland was a very particular colony. It had relationships with the Maritimes. It was British, but it also had a unique culture and was not automatically part of that vision of sort of the greater British North America.
So moving on to slide 22, you deal with the depths of the UPC, right? Slide 22. So you deal with the depths of the UPC as a motivation for confederation, is that correct?
That is,
So how was the depths of the UPC a motivation for confederation?
the UPC had found itself in considerable financial difficulty. They got excited about expansion. We talked before about the almost euphoria about constant growth, and that led them to invest in or subsidize railways, roads, bridges, ports, docking facilities, things of that sort. And they went heavily into debt as a consequence. So the UPC had debts in 1850 of about under $19 million. If you jump forward to 1859, so sort of only 10 years later, they're up to $54 million. So there's a big jump in the debt. And for many people, that was just, I guess a bridge too far in political terms. They were borrowing money at a time when public support for deficit financing was very small. There were a lot of concerns and a lot of worry about it. So the second bullet here is UPC still had, on paper, at least in terms of looking at the maps and thinking about this conceptually, had enormous economic potential. Think of the areas that went up to the Lake Superior area, north of the Great Lakes. On a map, you can see this huge amount of land, and if you compare that to where settlement has occurred, the settlement is down in the south, and you would think, boy, there's lots of room to grow, and there's going to be more railways and more roads. There'll be more settlers coming in. Several things got in the way of that. Number one, geography. The area north of Lake Superior was not an agricultural zone in the same way that the area north of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie were. You can't just grow up there and decide you're going to pick up farming areas in the places where farms won't work out very, very well. And the second thing, by the time you get to the 1850s, is the recent flow of immigrants into UPC had been of sort of a mixed success. There were a lot of very poor migrants who came in, particularly from Ireland, several 100,000 Irish moving into UPC. And they came poor and they stayed poor. Remember that animosity toward the Irish was very, very strong at this time. Real hostility from other people in British North America. So the growth potential was there conceptually. Some people got very excited about it, but the reality was it was expensive to build more facilities to make this all work together. So UPC said, we need another solution. We need another solution. We can't just keep borrowing money. There's a limit to how much we can borrow. You start seeing, if I can go to the third bullet.
Yes, please.
In 1858, Alexander Galt and others started presenting models for sort of a new national system. It was a model driven in part by financial considerations. A larger nation could actually borrow more money, would have more access to resources, would be able to extend its trade relations with Britain, with the United States, and with other countries. And so the goal here was to sort of deal with the shortcomings of the UPC by giving a broader platform. with access to more resources, more people, more government, more attention from investors, and what have you. So the last point here is the debt in UPC was very substantial. We can see this subsequently in the Confederation processes. But here's where this starts to filter into the political decisions that were made. Politicians in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were very concerned that joining with the United Province of Canada would actually just saddle the debt on them, that they would be held responsible for paying back the debt of the UPC. And they were very concerned as the conversation started that would be an outcome. You'd solve the UPC's problems by making it Nova Scotia's problem and making it New Brunswick's problem. And those two colonies were comparatively doing better than the UPC economically.
So on your bullet 3, you speak of Galt presenting ideas since 1858. So do these ideas he presented back in the day get taken on board eventually?
So one of the interesting things in the process is how much of this kind of played out in public. It's not always that way. When you do negotiations on major diplomatic and political transitions, often the conversations takes place in back rooms and you don't hear very much about it. One of the things about Confederation was the core ideas were actually out in the open, in this case in 1858, well before the Confederation process actually started. The ideas were out there and they subsequently, many of them got pulled forward.
So Galt was the sort of financial guy behind, the financial brains behind Confederation. Is that correct?
Alexander Galt ends up being sort of the financial guru, the person they turn to all the time. He was asked on several occasions to take leadership roles in the political process. He turned them down, but he was happy to play that more subordinate role, particularly on the financial side.
So on this slide, you were speaking of debts of the UPC, United Province of Canada, as a motivation for Confederation. But how would Confederation address these debts of the UPC?
So the belief was that it would do several things. First off, it would consolidate the debt and transfer it to a new national entity. So the debt would be removed from the colonies we now call Ontario and Quebec, but then called Canada East and Canada West, or Upper Canada, UPC. Secondly, that the national government, a new national government, because of its stature, because of its independence from Britain, would have greater capacity to raise revenue through various customs and excise duties and things of that sort. That a new entity, particularly one that aspired to be a grand transcontinental entity, could attract a lot of investment. It's interesting, a comparable process is underway in Australia at this time, where they're looking and talking about an eventual union, which took longer, but they were talking about it. And much the same terms of, if we're going to build a big country, how do we tie it together? So there's talk of railways. Railways are always a critical part in the 19th century of these kinds of ambitions. So a truly national enterprise, as opposed to a series of fragmented colonial enterprises, would attract the attention of the big financial institutions, maybe even get further support from Britain, attract international interest for the first time, and make the financial arrangements more feasible, more manageable. And I guess the last point would be, as is always the case when you have governments that are facing debt, is the most acceptable option for getting rid of debt is growth. If you can do something that will grow your economy, that the relative debt will actually decline because you're actually adding more people, you're adding more jobs. There's an increase in the number of companies, there's economic activity, and the debt proportionate to the overall economy starts to decline.
Thank you, Doctor. So moving on to the next slide.
Number.
Number 24, Jonna.
Thank you.
So up slide 24, you get into the financial discussions during Confederation. So can you tell us what these financial discussions were?
Absolutely. So this particular slide, slide 24, is like before, an overview. Is setting up the more detailed one. So I'll do this fairly quickly, and simply say that from the participants, particularly UPC participants, finalizing debts and liabilities of the colonies was a key priority. So they went into this conversation with the issue of dealing with these debts and liability sort of possibility to clear the balance sheets as it were. The second point is in no way was everybody sort of united as to where this confederation process might go. There was a general and growing belief that some union of the British colonies was a good idea. Johnny Macdonald, who was a leading advocate, actually favored a unitary state. And the unitary state is like Britain. You don't have subnational governments. Britain now has them in Scotland and Wales, but it took a long time for that to sort of emerge. But here, you have a situation where Johnny Macdonald thought of Canada as the new country as being a nation that would not necessarily have subnational governments or provinces or states. In his mind and other people's minds, one of the rationales for this was the Americans. The United States had states' rights was a huge reason for the American Civil War. The states wanted more independence. They wanted to set their own charts. Some wanted to keep slavery. Some wanted to get rid of slavery. And that became the source of conflict in the United States. Moving to a unitary state, politicians, particularly in the Maritimes, realized almost instantly would simply transfer all the financial obligations from UPC to all of the people in British North America. So it would automatically favor Ontario and Quebec, would automatically disadvantage Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So that idea was rejected. As I say in the third bullet, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, as they started these conversations, and I hasten to add, they're quite suspicious going into this process. Even as the conversations are unfolding, they're less than enthusiastic at times. They clearly had very strong colonial loyalties, and they wanted to have subnational governments, in this case provinces, that would actually provide some balance. So the politicians in Quebec wanted a mechanism that would preserve the integrity of Quebec. A unified country would not, a unitary state would not do that. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick very much wanted something that would protect their financial interests, which again, a unitary state they felt would not do so. So if you look at bullet 4, it simply makes an obvious point that's well known that starting in 1864, with the Charlottetown Conference, continuing to the 1866 in the Quebec Conference and then the London Conference in 1866, the politicians spent a lot of time on finances. And in one sense, the financial part was a game breaker. Either you get this right or we don't continue. Quebec had some game-breaking requirements around the rights of French Canadians and whatever. There had to be some sort of things that had to be in there. So starting in 1864, right through the Charlottetown Confederation process, financial matters were central to the conversation. And I simply end by pointing out that this has not ended now, that this has become a centerpiece of Confederation from 1867 to the present. We're still having debates about financial arrangements even now.
So still on slide 24, Dr. Coates, on bullet 2. So Johnny Macdonald had the proposal for a unitary state. Is that correct?
That's right.
And then this proposal was not agreed to by his fellow politicians?
He had very good trouble finding very many people who would support it.
And you mentioned at bullet 1 that one of the goals was to identify and finalize responsibilities for debts and liabilities. Why was that a central goal?
It was a central goal because it was the whole question of financial liabilities was a central goal because It was one of the main motivations. If you're one of your reasons for having a union of the Canadas is to deal with a financial crisis, it follows logically that is something you have to address. Point one. Point two would be that the UPC's financial difficulties were well known, particularly in the mid 1860s. So it was they were British North American politics played out in public view. These are all newspapers covered it very intensely. There's a lot of debate and discussion about what was going on. So people knew this was an issue. And the other parties made it very clear early on that they were concerned about this. They were concerned, I think I used the phrase before, concerned they would be saddled with the debt of UPC if the financial arrangements were not correct.
So at the last bullet, you speak of the Charlottetown Conference and the London Conference. So moving on to slide 25. This is where you start to deal with the Charlottetown Conference of September 1864.
Correct.
So what is the importance of having this conference?
And I think it's important to understand how the Confederation Pact came together. This is not a situation where the people were rising up in huge numbers and demanding that they all join hands and sing a great song of loyalty. This was a political deal put together by politicians and then subsequently sold to the population at large. And when you understand the origins of the process, you realize how unpredictable it was. This was not the way you would think you'd set out a nation building process. So the Charlottetown Conference was not called to discuss a union of British North America colonies. It was called to discuss a union of maritime colonies, and specifically Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. So there was a sense there among those three provinces that they had common interests, that they could somehow coalesce into a larger unit, that they would be bigger, they would be more influential. Prince Edward Island was needing some help with their problems. Nova Scotia had ambitions because it was doing well economically. New Brunswick looking to go through some transitions away from the logging industry as much as they could. So the gathering there was actually called to talk about a maritime union. So the politicians from the UPC learned of the Charlottetown Conference, that knew it was happening, and invited themselves. And we would like to come and meet with you. And so they did. And a couple of interesting things about that, most of them had never been there before. Again, the point is these colonies are geographically quite distinct. They're quite separate. There weren't a lot of natural lines between New Brunswick and Upper Canada, for example. You could get there, but it was hard to get there. So what happened is there's actually sort of almost like a ceremonial atmosphere. Hey, the Canadians are coming. There's a bit of a party atmosphere. It sounds like a small and trite thing, but I assure you this isn't. One of the most important things is that the UPC, not all of them, but the UPC political group actually brought their wives. And it's actually a well-known element of the Charlottetown Conference that because the wives were there, they had social events. They would finish their conversations, they'd have a meeting event, and having the women there humanized the whole process. They got to know each other, the wives talked to each other, they compared stories. They actually sort of, a bit of an esprit de corps it came out that might not have been there if it had just been a group of men meeting in a room for a period of time. It's actually quite significant. So Prince Edward Island was involved. If I go to my third bullet, if it's okay. Just to give a background again, Prince Edward Island was a very unique political economy. When it was established, the British government, when establishing Britain, had decided to replicate the sort of British class system on Prince Edward Island. So they carved up the island into 66 large holdings. These are not small farms, these are very big estates. And the people who owned the estates subsequently basically put them out to sharecroppers, to attendant farmers. So unlike Upper Canada and Lower Canada, where people could own their property, which was a huge aspiration of the 19th century, people in Europe were envious that you could come over to North America and own a farm. Prince Edward Island, you could come over to North America and be a tenant farmer, like in Britain. And many of the landowners didn't live in the Prince Edward Island. They managed their properties remotely, which actually gave them a very different sort of edge. They were concerned about the presence of UPC at this meeting, and they were less than fully engaged in the conversation. So you'll see as we go along that they sort of pull out of this confederation process. But the good point, the good news, they ended with an agreement that there was momentum among New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and UPC, and a moderate level of Prince Edward Island, that they actually could actually move along and have a second meeting, which was held in Quebec City.
So that second meeting is on your next slide, slide 26. So slide 26 is titled Negotiating Confederation Finances, Quebec Resolutions, October 1864. So can you tell us what do you have on this slide?
Yes, I can. First, just apologize for an errata that I have here, 60 and 61. This is the correct, but in my report, I actually had them labeled as 56 and 57. So this one you have here is the correct one. It's interesting, if I can start at the end of this slide, that the people who participated in the Quebec conversation would subsequently refer to the Quebec meeting as settling a treaty, that they actually saw it in that kind of a way. And it's a really important sort of use of a word. It wasn't a legal treaty. It wasn't signed in that way at all. But what they meant by that was we had an agreement. We came out of Quebec with what we call the Quebec resolutions or the 72 resolutions. We figured out the terms of union, but they're not really open for discussion. So the politicians that were there worked very hard. It's not a 5-minute observation or a 2-hour conversation. They worked really hard to sort of negotiate these terms. But they made it clear that when this went back out to the public at large, it was really not open for further refinement, which is really important because, like, for example, when they went back to Nova Scotia, where there was a lot of worry about this union process, some of the people, Joseph Howe was an opponent at the time, said, okay, let's go back and demand something else. And the people sort of said, well, we can't. This is the package. We've negotiated this kind of a package. And here we're talking about the financial arrangements. Here, section 60 was Government of Canada, general government, shall assume all debts and liabilities of each province. That's
And-
a really,
Excuse me, and section 60, you call it, is that resolution number 60?
yes,
Thank you.
sorry. And they also introduced this idea of a sort of a debt ceiling. That in fact, because one of the big concerns was that if the debt was left open-ended, that the different participants would be caught by surprise, that Ontario would come in with a much higher debt than what they'd agreed to, or that Quebec would have a higher debt, or New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. So they set these limits. And this comes back to Galt and his earlier reports and comments from before. So as written here, Upper Canada and Lower Canada had a joint debt of $62.5 million. Nova Scotia had one of $8 million, and New Brunswick one of $7 million. So those were fixed out as sort of a rough equivalency between the various colonies that would basically allow them to agree to this arrangement. There were sweeteners throughout the Quebec resolutions of things like we saw this later on with the commitment to intercontinental railway. This also becomes part of the agreement over time. So
what is the significance of these resolutions, of these Quebec resolutions?
Well, if you follow the line, the Quebec resolutions become the resolutions out of the London Conference and become the elements without a lot of change in the British North America Act. So the foundations of Confederation rest very much here.
So this is why you said they were referred to as the Quebec Treaty?
Well, two reasons. One is because, in fact, and please put treaty in quotation marks,
Yeah.
this was not a technical treaty. But partly because it was a carefully negotiated, carefully structured arrangement that looks like sort of a treaty. But the other part, as I mentioned, was the message coming out of Quebec was, we can't really go and reopen this before, if we're going to move ahead. These are lots of compromises based here. We can't just go back and revisit everything in public.
So moving on to slide 27. So here you see that there were, after the Quebec conference, still discussions ongoing, right?
Yes.
So can you elaborate on these bullets for us?
So after the Quebec conference, the proponents of union had to sort of sell the concept, and opponents of union had to fight against the concept, right? And so you have these ideas that have been formed. This is all public. People know the arrangements and know the kind of deals that have been tentatively struck. Alexander Galt was a key proponent in this process. He supported the idea of union very, very strongly. And he was also very much wrapped up in the financial arrangements. And he gave several talks and several speeches and wrote several reports, statements that talked about the details of the financial arrangements for public consumption. You know, again, this is not sort of done with, you know, the civil servants in the background. This is done sort of out in the open air. And they were the ones that identified that the UPC had a debt of the $65.5 million and identified that there was, you know, an Indian fund that was part of the debt of UPC that amounted to over $1.5 million. So he described the financial sort of deals and the financial arrangements quite clearly. And as I say in the second bullet, what's important here is the transparency, that these things were in fact, you know, relatively public. The newspapers covered them quite exhaustively. At that time, newspapers regularly reprinted entire speeches, entire sort of government documents and policy proposals. He knew there had to be seen to be equity and fairness in the process. That whatever the financial arrangements were struck, they had to be seen as being appropriate and fair for sort of all of the people involved, through the debt assignments and through per capita subsidies and everything else. If any individual colony felt particularly aggrieved, there's a good chance they would pull out. And to foreshadow something we're going to see fairly shortly, immediately after Confederation, 2 of the provinces threatened to pull out. So this is not a deal that had uniform support across all of the colonies. There was a lot of opposition, particularly in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick.
So
Can I just clarify? I presume I have this right. In the first bullet of the 62.5 million UPC debt, of which I think you say, of which the Indian fund represented, was that a calculation of the annuity obligations?
No, that was actually the Indian fund represented monies that were raised from the sale or lease or otherwise use of Indian lands, particularly in what's now called Southern Ontario. And a big portion of that actually came from Six Nations and the Haldeman Tract, the big controversy over the Haldeman Tract.
So if it's part of a debt,
yeah, it's a debt that the government has in their books, but is actually owed to the First Nations. It is First Nation
so
money.
the government is sitting on cash
Yeah.
that it owes to the First Nations.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
And please consider owes in quotation marks too, because the getting access to it was a controversial process.
Right.
It's not like it was their bank that they could go and take out whatever they wanted.
We understand that.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Thank you.
And Dr. Coates, what happened to that Indian fund after Confederation?
But I believe it was passed on to the government of Canada and maintained subsequently.
Is it better to say it was money that was raised from sales of Indian land that was held in trust for the First Nations, or is that going too far?
The only reason I hesitate, I'm not a lawyer, and so the words in trust have very specific meanings, but I think it was in a general sense, yes, very much. It was not, you mind a qualification? And I think it's an important one, is that what happened was particularly talking here about situations, say in Southern Ontario, what ended up happening was the money from the sale of lands went into this fund. Some of it came back out as the government's annuity payments. So in one sense, this is supposed to be your money. On the other hand, you're getting it back because the government owes you annuities. And they also use the money supposed to be used for Indigenous purposes. Some of it was actually used for commercial investments and investments in infrastructure. So if it was a trust, the trust suggests a different, higher quality of care and management of it
All right.
than what we actually saw in the early period.
Supposedly held for the Indians.
That would be better.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that the Indian fund consists of funds derived from the sale mostly of lands in the southern part of now Ontario.
Yes, mostly in the Haldeman tract.
So still on slide 27 on the third bullet. So you say that the financial situation was complex. So why was it complex?
Well, two reasons. The first thing I say in that third bullet is that if not handled properly, concern about finances could derail Confederation. People would just stop. We're not going to do this. These arrangements are bad. They favor UPC too much. So that was sort of the worst default. If we don't get this right, we'll lose this union momentum.
And you're saying that was a concern of the political
class? And particularly the UPC political class.
All
you know,
right.
this was something they were doing. That part of this, all the other motivations for Confederation applied uniformly. The financial one applied particularly to UPC.
Thank you.
When I say it's complex, it's the whole question of what is debt and where is it assigned. We've seen this through the arbitration process. We see this in this court proceeding. You know, this is a very, very complex matter. And what happened here, like a lot of the debt in quotation marks was, you know, government subsidies for private corporations. So they subsidized a railway in order to see it built. I mean, not much chance of it getting it back. The railways were going broke at this time, the ones in Upper Canada. And then this question of public works and how is the money being used and, you know, where does it actually factor in? This becomes really problematic after Confederation when they're starting to figure out how to assign the debts later on.
So one other question about bullet number 2. So at bullet number 2, you say that Galt focused on establishing a transparent level of equity and fairness in provincial debt assignments. Without getting ahead of ourselves, was this equity and fairness achieved at the end of the day in the Confederation process?
The short answer would be yes. The somewhat not very much longer answer would be that equity and fairness is in the eyes of the people who are affected by it. And were the other provinces, all the provinces convinced at the end that this was a fair arrangement? Taken as a whole, the political leadership came to that conclusion. We didn't have polling back then. We didn't have a referendum on this. So it's impossible to know what the public at large thought. There was a lot of anxiety about this in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So you can't say everybody in the country said, what a great deal. Among the political leadership who'd been party to all of the debates and all of the compromises, they found the financial arrangements acceptable.
So we can now turn to slide 28. So as slide 28, you speak about the Confederation debates. So can you take us through the bullets you have on this slide?
Yeah, just to point out that after the Quebec process, these documents and the agreements did go out for public conversation, and there was a lot of politicking going on. The key politicians, Alexander Galt, Johnny MacDonald, Georges Etienne-Cartier, were promoting the deal. The ones from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were explaining the deal. They were much more cautious about being unreserved enthusiasts about the agreement. Johnny MacDonald was of the UPC, absolutely key person in this whole process. He sort of moved the idea that this be given approval. He very much followed the lines of Galt, and remind you again that he was in favor of a unitary state, so he changed his opinion. He realized he was not going to get a unitary state, and that the federal model that was emerging was something that had to be, it was the best they could hope for at that particular time. So you can see in the third bullet, that MacDonald and Galt, like him, were very much in favor of a financially strong central government that would actually have the power to deal with the accumulated public debts of the various colonies, that they would be taking on that major assignment, that they would regulate trade and commerce, and have the power to hopefully expand trade and commerce, manage customs and excise, and raise money as authorized by parliaments. But John and MacDonald still believed in a very strong government. He didn't get a unitary government, but he got a strong central government, particularly on the financial side. That was where he put a lot of his emphasis. At the same time, the last bullet is important because Confederation is nothing more than, in the end, a compromise and a balance. You know, the colonies did not want to lose their identity. The colonies did not want to lose their autonomy, not independence, but at least their autonomy. And so the structure that we come up with here is, John and MacDonald expressed this sort of many times, is that they would control the things that were most important locally. You're going to have schools, they would control that. And the local roads, you would control that.
The colonies.
Sorry, my apologies. The colonies / provinces in this new structure. That the provinces would, and this new formulation, they'd have some opportunity to develop their own resources, particularly land and natural resources, in as much as they could. But also that the model they had over time was that the provinces would manage the local things. And I highlight something I should have highlighted here in this point, that this is particularly important for Quebec, you know, which very much wants to have control of its own social, cultural destiny. So local power, meaning here provincial power, was very essential. And we see this in Section 91 and Section 92, when we divide the powers between the federal and the provincial governments.
So on this slide 28, so you stated the speech of MacDonald's, John A. MacDonald. So did John A. MacDonald's position change vis-a-vis his first position for a unitary state?
John A. MacDonald was a compromiser of extraordinary ability, a consummate politician, and kind of ruthless, to be honest. It's not as though he does this, you know, without leaving some proverbial blood on the floor. You know, he's negotiating very hard and negotiating with many different people, and realizing that if you want to move the main object forward, you're not going to get everything that you want. And I should point out, to reinforce this, that John A. MacDonald's political career was built entirely in the coalition environment of the United Province of Canada's, where there was never sort of a single party government. It was a combination of people from Canada East and Canada West, and French and English, and reformers and conservatives, and always trying to create this balance. Maybe this helps a little bit in explaining something about 19th century politics, but there were a fairly substantial number of politicians who were referred to at the time as loose fish. We would call them independents. And these were individuals who were sort of none of the above. They weren't conservative, they weren't reformer, they just were local representatives. So you had to sort of bring these groups together and form some sort of sustainable coalition in order to get ideas across. So John and MacDonald made many, many concessions. The most important one was giving up on the unitary state idea, but then working very hard to get the strong, financially strong government of Canada.
So continuing on with the next slide, slide 29, sorry. So here you continue with the Confederation debates.
Yes.
Right? So can you take us through the bullets on this slide, so how the debates continue?
Well, first to point out that they do continue. Then we're talking here about Galt for the most part here. But the debates are sort of kind of raging is too strong a word because it makes it sound like everybody's gathered on the street corners to have a public debate about these issues, but they were very heavily discussed in the newspapers, very heavily discussed in the legislatures and whatever. So as I mentioned in the last side, one of the bullets is these colonies that are about to become provinces wanted to preserve their identity and wanted to maintain a substantial measure of autonomy. So this is the ultimate balancing act in Canada. You have a strong federal government, strong provinces, right? And over time, it ebbs and flows a little bit, but we see that at this time period. So Galt in 1865, February 7th, gave a major public address on the role of trade and resources and the financial condition of the British North America colonies. It's a worthwhile thing if you get a chance to read it to get a sense of the spirit of the time among the proponents of Confederation, because Galt's things were extremely optimistic. He gave a strong presentation on what the trade was already like in Upper Canada. You know, this is not talking here about a poor, marginalized place. It's a growing, bustling kind of Upper Canada in particular. Montreal is a major financial center. Nova Scotia has these huge fleet of ships that are going off around the world. New Brunswick has world-class, stands of timber. Prince Edward Island has phenomenal agricultural produce. So Galt is very much in these speeches a promoter of this, basically saying, if we do this, we can be a great nation. And I hope I'm getting across that part of this idea that the people who are proposing Canada were not backed into a corner and making a compromise deal just to sort of stitch together some weakly connected colonies. There was in this idea, this view that Canada could be a greater place and could in fact become one of the best countries in the world. So we're not used to that in Canada now, but in 1865, 66, 67, among some people, the opportunity here was to grow something quite great and quite dramatic. And keep in mind, just because it helps explaining Galt's enthusiasm, that you have in the back of the minds of everybody involved in the process, the possibility of acquiring Rupert's Land and British Columbia. Prince Edward Island was valuable, but not crucial. But that opened up the entire continent to this new country, should it actually be formed. So his point, Galt's point, was that you had to have an equitable deal in order to make this sustainable. But if it was put in place, he was absolutely convinced that you could actually build a truly great country. So that's kind of the value system that he's bringing into this process. The last bullet, if I could, what Galt is talking about there, see, people often have a very negative view of debts and liabilities. You spent money unwisely, you invested it in things you shouldn't have invested it, it's wasted or it's gone. And there was some of that. If you put money in, subsidize a railway and the railway goes broke, you haven't got much to show for your subsidy, for sure. What Galt was trying to say was that the debts and liabilities piece should be seen as part of the nation building exercise, that you're only going to have prosperity if you make decent investments. So the debts, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, UPC, the debts actually allowed you to build farms, to find mines, to cut down trees and build forest, do forest operations. It allowed you to attract new immigrants and to have places for them to go. I'm talking here of immigrants in the hundreds of thousands. It's not a small growth sort of plan. And to make it possible to sort of improve the economy for everybody. So that even if it was a government debt, you might actually get a benefit from lower priced manufactured goods or lower priced imported goods, because the government had wisely invested in these different kinds of activities. So this was not a big mea culpa. The provinces the colonies did a terrible job. Let's start over again. It was, The colonies made a whole bunch of very, very major important investments. We now have the foundation for a great nation. Let's proceed.
So at slide 30, you continue with the Galt speech on these two bullets. Can you take us through these two bullets?
Yeah, certainly. In the case of the first observation, these were fragmented colonies, and people had trouble seeing the whole thing. Again, because they hadn't been there. Very few people from Upper Canada would have ever been in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick, and vice versa. So what Galt was trying to sort of say was that the contributions, the investments, the infrastructure that had been developed in each of the colonies had actually made the Union possible. Now, Nova Scotia might have built ports, but now we had a great Atlantic outlet. New Brunswick or Upper Canada and Lower Canada might have built canals. Now we have access to the Great Lakes and to the middle of the American economy, the American Midwest. So these individual projects actually were the foundation for a new country. So that's kind of the message he's trying to get across, and trying to make it sound as though, debt's not a horrible thing. It was done for good and logical reasons with good and logical outcomes. And so the debt process, the idea of the nation taking on that responsibility on behalf of all of the Canadians, the new country, was actually a very logical thing. If you want to have a prosperous nation, you need infrastructure, you need immigrants. The central government will be taking on that role and making it possible to go even further. So in fact, the absence of a federal structure, a national government, had slowed all the colonies down. And now you would have the chance to build something much greater. And
So he's saying that the debt, although initially made by the colonies, essentially built an infrastructure for the nation, the bigger nation, the
Yes.
Confederation.
Yeah, and the Confederation was possible because the earlier politicians had made these investments, recognizing not all of them worked out, but they made those investments, and therefore you had the infrastructure for long-term prosperity. And I hope that I've conveyed what Galt was trying to convey, which was the sense of possibility, that a united set of colonies could be so much greater than the sum of the parts, to use an old standing phrase.
Thank you.
So how would, going on bullet 2, how would these infrastructure projects tie the colonies together?
So not perfectly, to be sure, because there was no intercontinental railway. And so there was the obvious tie would have been a railway that went from Halifax to Upper Canada. And interestingly, of course, that becomes one of the key elements in the British North America Act, right? So the idea of a transcontinental railway was something people had in mind. They'd actually talked about it many, many times, and they had actually built portions of it, sort of small pieces toward building some sort of larger network. You tie it together because you have all the elements a modern country needs. So you have roads, you have bridges, you have ports, you have post offices, you have government offices. So you've invested in these things over time. The infrastructure is there. This new country's not starting from scratch. This new country is actually substantially ready to go and able to take its place in their formulation, Macdonald, Galt, many of the people who supported Confederation, among the very great nations in the world. And we're not used to those kinds of aspirations in Canada, but that's the mindset at the time was, this could be a truly great country.
So is it also that the ability to travel from one BNA colony to another BNA colony?
Absolutely. The ability to travel was a central part of the formulation, not just now, but subsequently. So you'll notice that the Intercontinental Railway was included in the British North America Act, right? But when British Columbia joined Confederation, a key part of BC joining was a promise to build a railway that would actually join Upper Canada with British Columbia. So in that formulation, this is what you have to do to be a nation. Why is this so important? The United States has multiple railways under construction at this time. They're building transcontinental railways east to west. They actually had some races going on to see who could get there first. And each one of those railways would open up a huge swath of agricultural land. Open the land, you can bring in farmers, you create new cities, you create demand for industrial production. So the industrial manufacturing plants will actually have more to sell. That's how you build a nation in the 19th century. That's the concept that they had in mind. So important, I think, keep in mind, if you don't mind, that they have a working model of how this might actually unfold already in place. It's just south of the border.
So at that time, Galt was obviously a politician from the UPC, right?
Yes.
So he was tying his debt of the UPC to the development of infrastructure, right?
Yes.
Thank you. So we can move on to the next slide. Yes, sorry about that. I carried away with the debate. And I think it's time to take a 15 minutes break.
We'll take 15.
All right. So recess for 15 minutes.
Are we fine to proceed, Jonna?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. So Dr. Coates, we are done with slide 30. We can now move on to slide 31, the next slide. So at slide 31, you address the London resolutions of 1866, right?
Yes.
Can you take us through this slide?
Sure. Just a reminder that Confederation and the British North America Act are actually acts of the British Parliament. So the decision about whether or not there would be Confederation was not up to the colonies. They could make a representation, they could make an appeal, they could even make a detailed suggestion, but the final decision would actually come up to the British Parliament. So a meeting was held, lengthy meetings in 1866 with representatives from the colonies and representatives from the British Parliament to negotiate the final terms of the Confederation arrangement. Would highlight one very important part of this, and that is that the British government made it very clear that they would not stand in the way of the colonial aspirations. They did not see their role as being stopping this or vetoing the process. They've been supporting it and following it every step of the way. So they being the British government, understood what was actually unfolding in front of them. So what we have in the London resolutions actually emerge into the British North America Act. And I use as an example of this, the existing debt arrangements for the provinces and the federal relationship with the federal government outlined here in section 59 and 60.
So is there a particular reason why this conference was held in London, England?
It pretty much had to be. This was an act of the British Parliament. They were asking for the British Parliament to approve the arrangements. They negotiated in the colonial level, and they had to go through the Quebec resolutions and subsequent sort of conversations with the British parliamentarians to convert this into British law.
Who were they?
Sorry?
Who were
They this was the leaders coming from North America, from British North America.
Each of the provinces?
Each of the provinces sent representatives to come over. The 4 provinces, or actually, to be honest, at this point, they're colonies. There's only 3. So Upper UPC, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia sent representatives over to London to meet with British parliamentarians to actually finalize the arrangements.
Thank you.
So on your last bullet on slide 31, so this is what led So the conference led to the enactment of the British North American Act of 1867.
Correct.
So then we can move on to your next slide, slide 33, which is the Financial Arrangements Act Confederation. So we are now during the period where Confederation, the act has already been passed, and there are certain financial arrangements that have been made. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So can you take us through the bullets you have on slide 33?
Yes, and this is the scene setting slide. And I'm repeating something I've said before, but it's important to keep in mind that Ontario and Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick had to be reassured that their debts were being dealt with, particularly Ontario and Quebec, the new provinces of Ontario and Quebec. They wanted to know that they'd have a chance to go forward and to have the resources that a government would need to provide the local services and local support that they wanted to have. So the goal, one of the goals of Confederation, one of the necessities of Confederation, was you had to articulate in very detailed form the financial arrangements. So in the end of the day, what were the finances for Confederation? So simply say here that this happens in the British North America Act. It divides the responsibilities and defines the financial arrangements between the provinces and the Dominion of Canada.
So moving on to your next slide, slide 34. So here you continue with the financial arrangements at Confederation. So can you expand on the bullets you have here?
Yes, so what happens is that you British North America Act in section 91 and section 92 outline the responsibilities of the government of Canada and outline the responsibilities section 92 of the provinces. The financial arrangements were put in detail, particularly in part 8, but in sections 111, 112, 114, 115, and 118. Sections 111 and 112 basically show that the federal government is going to take over responsibility for the debt of the provinces, including the United Province of the Canadas. That was one of the goals and aspirations of many of the leaders, and it was achieved here. Secondly, they put an upper limit on the debt. So this was not an open-ended commitment. They had carefully scrutinized the Galt in particular, the financial situation. They established a debt limit. That debt limit was, we'll talk about later, subsequently increased. And the idea was to provide sort of an appropriate balance between UPC and the two maritime provinces, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. I think I mentioned this quickly before, but Nova Scotia and New Brunswick had their debt set at $8 and $7 million respectively. And Ontario and Quebec had them set at 62.5 million with the division to be determined. I would also point out that section 118 basically provides the financial support for the governments and legislatures going forward as well.
So all of these sections you just mentioned would reflect these financial arrangements within the BNA Act.
Correct.
So we can move to slide 35. So here you continue with the financial arrangements again. Can you explain what you have on this slide?
Yes, the first bullet was previously I described how they came to apportion the debt to Ontario and Quebec through the British North America Act. They also established a section 142 which was setting up a resolution, a way of apportioning the debt between those two provinces. I think it's fair to say that the provinces of Ontario and the province of Quebec were looking for ways to limit their liabilities, to have the financial liabilities absorbed by the national government to the greatest degree possible, in the hope they would get a final settlement that would sort of resolve their financial situation for once and for all. These processes are really important for a variety of reasons. I should point out that, again, there's a lot of animosity to Confederation in 1866, 1867, 1868. So the deal here was to provide an arrangement that would stop the provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick from walking away. That was a real live concern leading up to Confederation and an equally live concern after Confederation. We always talk of Western separatism in Canada now. The first separatist movements in Canada were in the Maritimes, in immediate aftermath of Confederation. So the concerns were real. These are not sort of, ridiculous ideas. The second part, which I think is important to keep in mind as well, that the people who drafted the British North America Act and Confederation were trying to make it attractive to other colonies. Confederation is not finished. They believed, many people believed, that Prince Edward Island would and could join soon. They weren't so sure about Newfoundland because Newfoundland wasn't so sure about them. There was this big question about the Hudson's Bay Company territories in Rupert's Land, and a growing question about British Columbia, which was a British colony, far removed, but a jurisdiction that would give Canada a Pacific outlet. And you have to have a Pacific outlet to be a transcontinental nation.
So on the first bullet of slide 35, you refer to the dispute resolution system, which was established under section 142 of the BNA.
Right.
So what is the importance of having this dispute resolution system?
To my mind, it recognizes the practicality of the founders of Confederation. They knew they had to figure a solution out. They also knew that if they waited to resolve it in 1866, 1867, that they might end up delaying Confederation for years. That if you said, we're not going to go ahead until we know the division of the debt, we're going to put everything on pause. Would you pause for 6 months or a year or 2 years? What instead they realized was we need to build in a way of resolving this ourselves. They knew that an apportionment was essential, that Ontario and Quebec had debts that they'd created jointly through the UPC, some that had predated 1841. They knew they had obligations. They knew they had to resolve it. So having this dispute resolution system was a very important part.
And was this dispute resolution system, as you call it, under section 142 resorted to?
Yes, it was. Yes. Yeah.
When was that resorted?
1870, they apportioned the debts.
So on the second bullet, you say that the provincial government sought to limit their liabilities. So why was it important for the provincial governments to try to seek to limit their liabilities?
Encourage everybody to keep in mind this is a very practical deal, right? This is not an emotion field deal. This is not one driven by ideological commitment or anything like that. So every party in the process is looking for an appropriate, fair, best deal possible for themselves. And for the UPC, we want to have the debt lifted off our colony. In the case of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they didn't want to absorb the debt of UPC, and they wanted some protection for their financial exposure as well. So the process here was done in such a way that they'd established a way to resolve what could be a very difficult problem. The question of how you separate debts, as even this proceeding shows, is a very difficult and complicated process.
So let's move on. Thank you for that. Let's move on to slide 36. So at slide 36, you say that the Dominion took over the pre-Confederation debts and liabilities. And you have two bullets. Can you take us through the two bullets you have here?
Yes, very simply, section 111 says Canada shall be liable for the debts and liabilities of each province existing at the time of union. So not post-Confederation debts, just pre-Confederation debts. Second bullet, basically pointing out that the section 11 and other parts of the BNA Act in section in part 8 showed continuity with the Quebec and London resolutions. This is a core part of the Compact of Confederation. It had been discussed extensively and was designed to provide, I call it here, certainty and finality. People wanted to know they had a deal. They wanted to know the parameters and the nature of that deal. You do not get politicians here. When I say the they, I'm talking how the politicians of the new confederation, the new provinces, et cetera, did not want to have an arrangement where they were going to spend the first 2 decades or whatever, sort of building the structure from the ground up. It's quite an amazing process that they got. So much of what we now live with today was actually dealt with fairly quickly through these conferences.
So at your second bullet, you explain the relationship between this section and the Quebec and London resolutions.
Yes.
So are they drawn from these? So is section 111 drawn from these resolutions?
Very, very much so, yes.
So moving on to slide 37.
In case you were thinking that you needed to go through those, I think we're all.
So broadly, can you tell us what you have on on slide 37 without having to read? Why did you include these sections?
Kind of anticipating the response you've given. Nonetheless, it's an important part of this overall puzzle. And these sections just outlined exactly who was responsible for what in this process. So the government of Canada, the Dominion government is taking over the major revenue sources. The unitary state idea has been dismissed, and there's an arrangements being made here and right through into section 118 that actually provide the provinces with financial resources to go forward.
So section 112 would refer to Ontario and Quebec, 114 to Nova Scotia, and 115 in New Brunswick.
Correct.
So moving on to slide 38. So you refer to financial relief to the new provinces. So why was there a need to provide financial relief to the new provinces?
What's happening in the Confederation process through the British North America Act is you've created a new national government, and the new national government has the most important revenue streams available to it. This is Johnny McDonald's vision of a strong central government. This is not a situation where the provinces have a lot of their old former authority. So you have to do a structure in such a way that says we will make sure that the governments of the provinces still have the resources they need to operate properly. And two issues to that. One is you manage the debt through debt ceiling and the corporation of the debt, and debt relief in other ways. And you find other ways of funding the governments to make sure that there is some federal money going back to the governments on a regular basis. These two pieces are tied closely together.
So can you
Isn't
take
it,
us?
sorry, isn't it also tied to, you use the words, I think, authority and also debt, but isn't it because in Confederation, they're losing their revenue streams?
Very much. Yes.
Okay, so they lose the revenue stream, so they get subsidies.
They lose their revenue streams. They also give up a lot of their responsibilities because the federal government is now
Yes.
doing those.
But the question was, why do they need subsidies?
Yes, they still have Section 92. They have a long list of things they have to do.
Right,
Thank you.
okay.
And by they, you mean?
The provinces. Provinces have Section 92 responsibilities, and they need some guarantee of resources to sort of cover those costs.
And you mentioned the revenue streams of the Dominion.
Yes, the Dominion had the primary revenue streams, particularly customs and excise duties.
So let's go through the bullets you have on slide 38.
Yes. So Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were doing relatively well. New Brunswick's economy was starting to turn a bit away from the forest industry and did not have a lot beyond forest industry at this time. We forget how important and central the forest industry was in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s to the whole country. But they had relatively good economic prospects. And I mentioned before that the big shipping industry out of Nova Scotia was on the cusp of a transition, the metal ships that were coming along, but they still hadn't come yet, so they still had great opportunities. UPC needed debt relief. They could not go forward without debt relief, and also needed the long-term revenues. So what they did was in the agreements that they have is they arranged for New Brunswick and Nova Scotia to be, I'd say, recognized for not having excess debt, not having built up so much debt. So they had a debt ceiling of $8 and $7 million respectively. But if they did not take up that debt ceiling, then they would actually get an annual payment from the government of Canada as sort of an allowance for not having used up their debt, their full debt ceiling. And that would provide a revenue for them. So they were being essentially rewarded for not being in debt or recognized for not being in debt.
And on the next slide, slide 39. Here you have a section 118, right?
Right.
So I won't have you read the whole section 118, but just to tell us, why did you include section 118 within your slides?
Just to show that the financial arrangements were a package and a fairly tightly constructed package. And the participants, particularly Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and obviously UPC, were very concerned that the financial package be fair and equitable and allow them to actually proceed with the responsibilities as laid out in the British North America Act. So I included this to simply show that the founders of Confederation clearly understood this need to have these alternate revenue streams.
And in this section, we see Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick.
Correct.
So then moving on to slide 40. So here, the slide is titled Financial Resources Available to the New Dominion. So what were these financial resources which were now available to the newly created Dominion of Canada, right?
Yes, the Dominion of Canada had, and Section 91 had laid out some of the things in terms of customs and excise, the duties and the different kind of government operations. If I could back up a little bit and point out that once the union is created, there's a collective commitment to the success of all constituent parts. It might have been a rivalry going in. You're competing a little bit to make sure you get a fair deal. But at least conceptually, there was this idea that once Confederation was done, you want the provinces individually to succeed, and you need the federal government to succeed on behalf of everybody, right? So there wasn't they're trying to find that balance that you don't want to get a situation where 15 years on, you have a massively powerful central government, which Johnny MacDonald, you'll remember, was actually in favor of. And you don't want impoverished provinces that have been stripped of all their revenue and all their resources. So the federal government had greater financial resources. They had the right to create new revenue streams through different kinds of taxation. So they had, but they also had it on a much larger scale because they could draw it in from across multiple colonies on behalf of the nation as a whole. So the government of Canada, the politicians behind the government of Canada had ambitions. I remind you that, I don't think I mentioned this before, that George Brown, who was a key member of the coalition, the Great Coalition, was also a key promoter of Western expansion. And many people in Southern Ontario in particular, less so in Quebec, had this vision that the prosperity of this new union would actually be found in the West. And the reason they had that vision was because it worked out in the United States, and that having literally millions of people flood onto the prairies in the United States made Eastern United States extremely wealthy. So the vision was that one, and that there'd be ways of collecting money off the sale and shipment of supplies and goods on customs duties, customs taxes, things of that sort, that would actually allow Canada to flourish, so that it could make the major investments that were required.
So on your second bullet, you state that the new government of Canada would have the financial resources needed to operate the country, right?
Right.
And the provinces would be freed from liability for debts incurred, largely for public infrastructure.
The freedom from liability was a very important part of this. Yes, correct.
And on your last bullet, did you cover your last bullet?
I did not. I'll do that now. The Confederation arrangements left responsibility for lands and natural resources in the hands of the provincial government. And that's a very, very important and very deliberate sort of part of this, this process. The natural resources were to be a future source of revenue, depending on the country and the province that you're in, as to how much revenue it's going to be and where they're going to get it from. And the idea was that that was one of the primary sort of things available to the provinces to cover their responsibilities, as outlined in section 92. So perhaps just as a way of demonstrating this process, you think a little bit about what happens when Canada does expand to the West, which happens only 3 years after Confederation. So they purchase the Hudson's Bay Company territories for a very, very small amount of money, $300,000, and land allocations to the Hudson's Bay Company. So Hudson's Bay Company was well looked after. Don't feel too sorry for them. But the idea was that the federal government would have access to the lands, and they would use the lands to develop the West. So Manitoba did not get control of lands and resources. The Northwest Territories did not have control of their lands and resources. The federal government used it, and they allocated the land to attract immigrants. So essentially very inexpensive land allocations. They used the land to subsidize railways. So rather than, they did give some money, particularly the Canadian Pacific Railway, but generally they use subsidies of land, allocations of land, to actually give the railway company the resources they needed to build the railway. The process sort of unfolded. It's important to add that the returns from this in Western Canada proved to be very disappointing.
The return from what?
The returns from the development of the West. So it took a while to build the railway, longer than they initially hoped. The immigration didn't come as quickly as they thought it would. So they had a vision that was not immediately realized. It took another 25, 30 years before they actually got the development that they expected in Western Canada. I simply say these again to reinforce the element to which there's this grand dream of Canada that lay behind all of these arrangements and these plans.
So on your bullet 3, if we look at the period prior to Confederation, what were the revenue streams of the UPC?
They had access to substantial revenue streams, the customs and excise taxes and things of that sort. There were monies to be made off land sales and natural resource development, but those monies always came with expenses associated with them. So if you're going to open up an area for settlement and maybe get some money from the sale and lease of lands, you have to develop roads and other infrastructure to get into those areas. So I wouldn't say it's a zero-sum balance, but it was unsure depended on the subsequent economic activity.
And after Confederation, out of the revenue streams you mentioned, the customs tariffs would be transferred to
Federal government.
the federal government.
Yes.
So let's now move on to slide 41. So here you say that even after 1867, the Dominion was still a work in progress. So can you expand on the bullets you have on this slide?
Yes, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It's not a critical way of saying somehow the founders of Canada did a terrible job. In terms of building a country from a selection of colonies, they actually did quite an amazing job in the time that they had available to them. Simply to point out that nobody gets absolutely everything right the first time, and that you have to work out the details. So the allocation between the debts between the UPC and Ontario and Quebec is a really good example. But they had ongoing discussions as Confederation sort of worked out. Things did not happen exactly as they planned. So simply point out two things, and one's sort of the economic side, that Nova Scotia's economy started to decline in the latter part of the 19th century. New Brunswick's declined quite substantially. The West really didn't take off until the early part of the 20th century. So that vision of a great Western expansion didn't actually happen. The cost of building a railway to British Columbia took down at least one government and caused all sorts of financial problems. So the dream was hard to realize in that way. So that's the sort of the downside. And so we're still working through. They had to come up with more subsidies for the railways than they planned to have, for example, for Western Canada. A lot more money than they expected when they brought British Columbia in. But the other part that I think we forget almost entirely is, and this is just calling on everybody's historical imagination, put yourself in Canada in July of 1867 and think, now what do you do? You've just created and announced a new country. So where do the staff come from? What offices do they go in? What new rules and regulations do you have to pass? How much legislation do you have to bring in? There are 1,000 duties. And remember at the time, the government was very small. We get so used to thinking of government in 21st century terms with many, many hundreds of employees doing all these different jobs at different levels. In 1867, there's a handful of people. And a lot of the politicians had to make an interesting choice. So you've been, say, the premier of Nova Scotia in the case of Joseph Howe, and you've led the battle against Confederation, even after Confederation. But as you watch Canada develop, you realize the most exciting work in the country is being done in Ottawa, not in Halifax. So Joseph Howe eventually joins the federal cabinet and becomes a key federal leader. This happens, many of the politicians, the Johnny MacDonald as an example, does this as well. Oliver Mowat goes up there initially and then comes back. So you have a vacuum at it's not a complete vacuum, but you lose a lot of political leadership at the provincial level because they've moved into national politics, right? And the politicians have to decide which is the right platform for them. So some stay, some go, enormous amount of turnover. With so much work to be done by so few people that I think I probably haven't captured this very, very well, but it's important to understand that when you look at these things through documents, what you just see are a series of chronology of this letter and this letter and this idea and this idea and this meeting and this decision. I remember reading, if you don't mind me saying, looking at the letter book for the Prime Minister from the 1880s, I think it was at the time I was looking at it. And they have a letter book where every single letter written to the Prime Minister is copied on onion skin paper so you can actually see what's there, every single one, right? And you look at the dates, and there's like 150 or 200 letters in a single day that are coming in that they have to be copied and they're going out from the Prime Minister's office. And you think of the incredible complexity of what it means to create a new country. I simply, suggest that this is a very difficult time, very exciting time for some people. You have divided loyalties. You have people who are angry that their colony has lost its identity and is now a subnational government. You have others who are truly excited about being part of a new nation, particularly when it goes from 4 colonies to adding Manitoba and Rupert's Land, and then adding British Columbia. They did that from 1867 to 1871. That's a huge accomplishment.
And on your 4th bullet on this slide, you refer to adjustment in subsidies and debt allowance. So are these part of what you refer to as the work in progress?
Very much so. The people did what they thought was best. They did what they thought would reassure everybody, get people as close as they possibly could to believing this was going to be a good and workable arrangement for all, right? Then history happens. All of a sudden, these different things start to occur, and the world doesn't unfold exactly the way you thought it would. And you start doing the studies and the background work and things of that sort. And so adjustments are made to the debt allowances, and the subsidy arrangements are made as well. So what I say at the final part of that bullet, the 4th bullet, is that the Confederation deal wasn't a slam shut. They wanted to get as much, as firm and as clear commitments as they possibly could, but it wasn't absolutely complete. And you end up with this reality that, for better or worse, the federal-provincial relationships end up being sort of an open-ended sort of process with lots of pushback and whatever.
So we can move to slide 43, where you refer to ongoing political discussions after 1867. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, this is an interesting piece for a political historian to sort of make do, because on the one hand, the Confederation deal was struck. It went through a long process. Remember those really good formations back in 1858 all the way to 1867. It was a long process of discussing this. Carefully constructed financial arrangements is how I describe them, particularly a series of political compromises. That it was a balance between nobody got 100% of what they wanted in the Confederation process. Now you have a new national government that's under considerable pressure. This is not a unitary state. This is my 2nd bullet. It's not the one that John A. Macdonald wanted. So now you have divisions of powers between the federal and provincial government. And those work out slowly as the governments get used to operating their responsibilities and putting them into effect. So a lot of the decisions that shaped us right till the present were made in this confederation process. But the last bullet says, and I make the point here, that this is inevitable in every federal system, that you will have ongoing debates about the balance of powers. If you were in Australia, you'd be talking about the national government and the state governments, right? Switzerland has figured its way out better than most, but Canada is a federal state where the federal and provincial governments debate their roles and responsibilities quite extensively. You also get a situation where they defend them rigorously. The provinces do not want to give up, as their minds, anymore. The federal government sees it has huge responsibilities, does not want to give up anymore. So this tussle over liabilities and responsibilities just remains ongoing. It is an inevitable part of a federal system.
But you also mentioned at bullet 1 of this slide that Confederation was a carefully constructed financial arrangement, right?
Yes, I didn't use the word perfectly. It was carefully constructed. It had to be saleable in the moment. So at the point where they came back from, really actually from Quebec, but certainly when they came back from London with the British North America Act, they had to have a system that they could say, this works for everybody to the greatest extent possible. So it was carefully constructed to achieve that. Was everybody happy? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they had provincial elections that resulted in the election of people devoted to defeating Confederation, to breaking it up. The first federal election, there were 19 seats in Nova Scotia. 18 separatists were sent to Ottawa. Right? There are 18 people whose job it was to go to Ottawa and break up Confederation. So carefully constructed, yes, in the sense that it overcame those problems. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick stayed, but not without tension and not without a lot of uncertainty. So that's why I deliberately didn't use the word perfectly. It was imperfect, and because of that, there were ongoing debates and discussions subsequently.
So we can move on to the next slide, slide 44, where you continue with the ongoing political discussions. You have
Right.
2 bullets there. Can you go through these bullets first?
This is very simple to point out that what we were talking about at this point in 1867 and subsequently remain a part of Canadian culture. We've been having these debates endlessly. Section 91 and 92 were drafted in the middle of the 1860s. There's an awful lot of stuff that we live with now that was not encountered at that time. There were a lot of events that had occurred at that time, and people didn't know how you're going to fund a Second World War, for example, right? So this balance between the provinces and the national government have unfolded very unevenly over time. I used here the one example that stands out. When we got into the business of a national health care, which was really a creation of the 1960s, and you have a federal government creating a national program, but it's delivered by the provinces. You just see how incredibly difficult that one issue is. And Confederation has many of those, right? Not because people were bad-spirited. I can assure you in 1867, virtually nobody was talking about a national healthcare commitment delivered by the provinces. That whole idea of government having that level of responsibility was unheard of, largely unheard of.
So then on slide 45, you refer to tensions after Confederation.
Yes. So
Can you tell us what these tensions were about?
So I've jumped ahead a little bit on myself responding to the earlier question, but I'll summarize this quickly. I want to quickly make a point about historians. We've had a lot of historians studying Confederation for a long period of time, and they've talked a lot about the balance, the personalities and processes. I do want to highlight the fact that those historians who focused on personalities and politics, there aren't very many of them anymore. That when I was a graduate student doing my postdoctoral studies, we had to read all of these books, the Donald Creightons and the A.R.M. Lowers and the W.O. Mortons. That was what we read. If you look at a reading list now, you'll find none of those. If you're lucky, if you take political history, you might find 1 or 2, but they've gone. And history has changed from the study of personality and politics into social history, cultural history, economic history. So our capacity as a nation to have this conversation is getting weaker, interestingly. As a country, we know less about Confederation and its processes than we did 30 or 40 years ago, which is kind of sad. I'd say this as a public policy professor. I have students who've even got a history degree, even a master's in history coming into my PhD program, who do not understand Confederation. They've never read the British North America Act or the Indian Act. It just is a shift away from studying politics as a central feature. So apologies for that digression. That's a personal one. Had to get it on the record somewhere. So I'm sorry, Your Honor. So what happens is, if the tensions are real, and the tensions to a certain extent are inevitable, they reflect the fact that the that each of the colonies has a very distinctive culture. It's obvious in the case of Quebec. Quebec becomes the embodiment of French Canadians within Confederation. And they clearly have different legal system. They have the role of the church. They have the remnants of the seigneurial system. They have all those things are there. But it's equally true in British Columbia when they join. And it's equally true of Nova Scotia. These are unique political jurisdictions, and they have very different, I guess, aspirations, different interpretations of how the country should actually operate. But I think it's important that when you think of Canada sort of working out, and I suggested before that you try to control having this idea that Canada is logical or that it's inevitable. We all live in Canada. We know what it looks like, and we know that it has all the component parts. But we have to avoid the temptation to see that as a very logical, inevitable exercise. When you go back and look at it, Seattle, Washington should be in Canada. There's no question of that in my mind as part of British North America, maybe even Portland, Oregon, right? Imagine how different Canada is if that had actually occurred. Those are big changes. But also imagine if Polk had actually pressed in 54-40 and fight, had actually pressed to have the boundary not go to the 49th parallel, but to go to the middle part of British Columbia, which would be Vancouver would be in the United States. So there's nothing sort of inevitable about this. And just because it came together doesn't mean it stays together. The Americans had a civil war, which they fought over the question of whether we belong together or not. And the Americans added most of what we think of as the United States was actually added, subsequent to the American Revolution, Louisiana Purchase, the war with Mexico over Texas, annexation of California. So the point here that I wanted to reinforce is these tensions were very substantial. Secessionist movements in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, people who were voting to sort of break up the Union just as it was starting. Oliver Mowat, who was a part of the Confederation process and a member of Parliament, goes back as the Premier of Ontario and becomes the leading national advocate for provincial rights. And Ontario was the leader of the provincial rights movement. In the eyes of Ottawa, Ontario in the 19th century was the equivalent of Alberta today, pushing back very hard in terms of the regional interest, fighting against federal authority. We get the development of Western protest. So the very first thing that happens when Canada takes over control of Rupert's Land, this happened in 1870, is there's a Red River resistance. The people of Red River rise up and say, we don't want to be part of Canada, or at least not until we have the right terms. And that leads to the negotiation of the Manitoba Act.
I don't want to limit you, Professor, but possibly we're dealing in a time period closer to Confederation that's important to us.
That's good, thanks.
And so on your last bullet, you referred to a meeting in 1870.
Yeah, so just closer to Confederation, I hope, that you have a period where situation where the provincial premiers were questioning the structures of Confederation. It's not to talk about it as a high level crisis, just provincial frustration showing up, people gathering together to see if they could actually try to sort of force a reconsideration of federal provincial relationships. So it's a huge part of Canada's history that these post-Confederation tensions continued.
And that was 1887?
1887, yeah.
Thank you.
So we can move on to, or maybe you can break today. We have a hard stop at 4:15, so I will be taking on a new slide.
All right.
Which would be slide 46.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll stop today, and I understand we're starting at 9 tomorrow. No?
Sure.
Yes,
That would be
only if we need to.
I don't
frankly.
think that's necessary. I don't think I'll be, certainly not more than 2 hours. just an hour and a half.
Very good.
So then we can start at 10. I have
Let's-
maybe like
Let's
3
do that.
hours, 2 hours.
Thank you very much.
All right. Oyez, 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 the city's of Court have now concluded on the